Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, for it is indeed afternoon. Delighted you could come. Thank you very much on a bright day like today. There are other alternative ways of enjoying yourself than coming and listening to a nerdish historian talking about what I hope you will find an interesting subject. My name's Nick Higham, and 2 years ago I wrote this book. It's called The Mercenary River, and given in the past 2 years, I've given this talk or versions of it around 60 times, and I usually start with an apology, because if you look at the cover of the book and you look at the title, people tend to assume that it's a book about the River Thames, and it's not. I have to apologise for that if you were thinking it was. It's actually a history of London's water supply. But it doesn't say that, because if you put a history of water supply on the front cover of the book, you get my point. People seem to think it's boring. I think they think it's all about pipes and pumps, and unless you're an engineer, that's not really very interesting. Well, I have to tell you, and I would say this, wouldn't I, that actually it's a lot more interesting than that, because the history of water supply, of delivering large quantities of potable water to a city like London, growing immensely fast between 1500 and 1900 or thereabouts, was a very challenging task. And so the history is, yes, it is partly about reservoirs and pipes and so on, but it's also a social history, because it's a history of the way in which people used water. It's a business history, because the early suppliers of water to London faced challenges in terms of the way they structured and organised their businesses that nobody had ever faced before, and so they had to come up with some novel solutions, some of which we're still living with today. And it's also particularly a political history, because particularly in the 19th century, London's water supply, surprising though this may seem, was a really live and controversial national political issue. And the politics revolved basically around the conflict between the public interest, the public wanted clean water at affordable prices, and the private interest of the shareholders in the private water companies that supplied the water, who weren't really interested in the public, they were interested in the profits and the dividends. And it took best part of a century to solve this political conundrum, and that was done eventually by effectively nationalising London's water supply and taking it into public ownership. And if you've been following the news, you will realise that history is repeating itself. We might come to that in the questions. So there's lots in this book which I can't possibly touch on in a short talk. There's nothing, for instance, that I'm going to talk about today about fraudulent accounting in Victorian business, though there is a chapter about that in the book. There's nothing in this talk about the history of London's local government, though again, there's a chapter about that. And I'm not going to tell you today why one London water company in the 1870s cut off several hundred customers, probably some thousands of people, even though it knew they had no alternative source of water. If you want to know about that, you're going to have to buy the book. And as luck would have it, I have hardback and paperback copies. I will be pleased to do business with you at the end. They sell at discounted prices. I take cash or card, and I will sign each one individually. So that's what I'm not going to talk about. What am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to start by talking about this, which is of particular Hackney interest. It's called the New River. It's not a river, it's an aqueduct constructed to bring fresh water from Hertfordshire to the City of London, and it's not new because it was completed more than 400 years ago in 1613, and remarkably, it is still a fully functioning part of London's water supply. Roughly 10% of London's water comes down the New River, quite a lot of it into Hackney every day. And after I've talked about the New River, I'm going to broaden the talk out a little and talk about a bit more about the general history of water in London. And if from time to time you find me looking at my phone, that's simply because it's the only way I have of telling the time and knowing how much time I've got left. So a bit about the New River. It starts these days at the River Lee, about halfway between Ware and Hertford. And if you walk along the towpath of the Lee, you'll come to this building, which was constructed in the 1850s. It's called Newgage. And every day, a maximum of 22.5 million gallons of water, in old money, come through that aperture at the bottom and flow down the river towards London. Originally, it ran for, although the distance as the crow flies, only about 23 miles to the river's terminus. Originally, it flowed for about 40 miles because it followed the 100-foot contour to the west of the River Lee. So every time it came across a tributary of the Lee, like the Hackney Brook, it would take a big detour west. And every time it came across a hill, it would take a big detour right and to the east. And most of those kinks have been ironed out in the subsequent centuries. They've been put into pipes and so on. But it's still quite a striking feature. If you know where to look for it, it's quite a striking feature in the landscape. And it was built by a man called Hugh Middleton, who was a goldsmith in London in the reign of King James I. He was a wealthy man, because goldsmiths were. He was also of a very entrepreneurial cast of mind. He pursued a number of projects. Supplying water to London was only one of them. And he was, as well as having an eye to the main chance, he pursued these projects because he thought they might make money. He was also something of a philanthropist. He's rather forgotten today, but the Victorians knew about him and rather admired him and put up several statues. This one, as you can see, is on Islington Green, and there's another one at one of the four corners of Holborn Viaduct. But though he was a very wealthy man, he didn't have enough money to undertake single-handed the very considerable kind of civil engineering task of digging this aqueduct. So he did something which was becoming quite common in the London of Queen Elizabeth and King James. He formed a joint stock company, a joint stock venture. And there were plenty of these, but they were almost all to do with overseas trading voyages. A bunch of merchants would get together, they would jointly hire a ship, they would jointly fill it with a cargo, hence joint stock. The cargo would go off, they'd sell the cargo, but buy another one, bring it back, sell it at, they hoped, enormous profit here in London. And at the end of that, the venture would be wound up and all the investors would take their capital out and the thing would lapse until the next joint stock venture was launched. But you couldn't do that with an aqueduct. You couldn't just parcel up bits of it and sell it off when you'd done with it, because you were never going to be done with it. It was going to stay there, if not forever, then for a very long time indeed. And so Hugh Middleton did something which I think nobody had done before. He started a joint venture company, which he called imaginatively the New River Company, which was permanent. First permanent joint stock company in British history, probably therefore in the world, and the forerunner, therefore, of every subsequent business corporation around the world. It was a prototype. It wasn't a perfect prototype. There were various quirks which were not repeated in most subsequent joint stock companies, but it was the first, and it provided a template. Who were these shareholders that he got in? Well, they were, like him, mostly rich London merchants. Here's two of them. The one on the right is a man called Peter Van Law. I need to put the microphone closer to my mouth. Peter Van Law, who was originally a Dutchman, and he was said to be the richest commoner in England in the reign of James I. And the one on the right was a man called Backhouse. And Backhouse got involved because he owned a piece of land on rising ground between Clerkenwell and Islington. This river needed to end somewhere. There needed to be a reservoir, a pond, into which it flowed, and from which water could be distributed in pipes down into the City of London by the New River Company as a business. And Backhouse owned a perfect piece of land. On it there was a duck pond, quite a large piece of open water. And Middleton went to Backhouse and said, do you want to join in? We can use your duck pond. And Backhouse said, okay. And he was obviously very proud of his connection with the New River Company, because when some years later he had his portrait painted, he asked the artist to include in the portrait a little landscape picture of what was called New River Head. And he's resting his arm on it. And I hope you can see there is a circular reservoir which is surrounded by a wall. And around that, you may not be able to see because it's a bit light here, there is an irregularly shaped piece of water. That's the original duck pond. And at one corner, there is a building which was imaginatively called the Water House, which housed the pipes and taps and cocks and so on, which controlled the flow of water to customers in the city. And there was one other very important shareholder, and that was this man, the King, James I. What happened was that during construction of the aqueduct, some of the landowners along the route started being difficult and were threatening to get an Act of Parliament which would rescind the act that gave Middleton permission to build this thing in the first place. And Middleton, who was obviously quite a shrewd political operator, quite apart from anything else, circumvented this opposition neatly by going straight to the top. He went to the King and he said, I'll make you an offer. If you invest, put up half the money for building my aqueduct, I'll give you a half share in the New River Company and half of the profits, because of course it's going to be very profitable. And James thought that sounded like a good idea and agreed, and miraculously the opposition evaporated. And it was a very good investment. Unfortunately, James I's son, Charles I, one of our less successful kings, didn't see it in quite that light. He inherited the crown and lots of other stuff, including his father's half share in the New River Company. And he thought, although it was making money, making a profit, it had not yet returned enough money to pay back the original investment. So he decided to get rid of it. So he went to Middleton and he said, I will sell you my half share in the New River Company, sell it back to you for £500 down and £500 a year in perpetuity. £500 a year was quite a lot in those days. But when I tell you that the New River Company went on to be the most profitable company in British corporate history, you will see that this was another of Charles I's many mistakes. What's the evidence for its profitability? Well, in the 1980s, a historian as fascinated as I am by the New River sat down and worked out that if one of the original shareholders had, by some miracle, survived right through until 1904, when the company was bought out by the Metropolitan Water Board, he, and of course they were all men, he would have enjoyed a return on his initial investment, taking into account 300 years of dividends plus the final purchase price of 267% per year. And I defy you to show me any other legitimate investment that will return anything like that kind of money. So a bit more about the New River. Where did it flow? Well, here is a map of London in the 1930s. Don't ask me why I chose a 1930s map of London when I first did this. Give you an idea of where we are. That's the M25, and reading from right to left, that's the M11, the A10, the A1, and the M1. And the New River runs parallel to the A10 and to the River Lee from its source up there near Hertford down to this point called New River Head. On the way, it passes a rather picturesque spot at Great Amwell in Hertfordshire, just south of Ware, which was one of the two original springs. The water didn't originally come out of the river. Originally, it came from two springs, but one of them ran dry, this one at Amwell, and the other one produced nothing like enough water to supply the growing demand. And it's a very agreeable walk, even in rather wet and overcast conditions, particularly in its northern end. There's a path you can take which runs along beside the river for most of its distance. It's not a public footpath. The river is owned by and operated by Thames Water, so you're walking on it at their discretion. And along the way, you pass a number of rather imposing Victorian pumping stations, which sit atop artesian wells drilled down into the chalk, and which supplement the flow that comes out of the River Lee with additional water. And you also pass, I can't remember how many there are, I think there are about 40, these buildings like this on the left. And if you go up to the East Reservoir and the West Reservoir, just off Green Lanes, you can see two of them. And they were built in the 1980s for something called the Artificial Recharge Scheme. Sounds like a great idea. The idea was that you pump all this water up and put it into the New River. But when there's lots of water in the New River, when there's lots of water in lots of rain, lots of water generally, you've got a surplus. So why don't you pump it back down in to recharge the chalk aquifer? It was a nice idea. It doesn't work. One reason is that the water that comes out of the New River is full of bits. I mean, it's not particularly dirty, but it's got bits in it. And if you put those back into the chalk aquifer, all that happens is you clog up all the tiny little capillaries in the chalk. So I can't get a straight answer from Thames Water about this, but I have been told that when they do use this system, they pump back into the chalk aquifer water which they have expensively treated. So this is pure London drinking water, which is being put down into the chalk. It runs through, or used to run, through Central Enfield, and there's quite a picturesque little corner with the Crown and Horseshoe pub. It's purely ornamental at this stage. I said that a lot of the meanders were straightened out. They straightened out the bit past Enfield, but they left the water in because it's quite attractive, quite appealing, and it also, because it's hugging the 100-foot contour, there are points at which the slope is quite steep, and you can see in this photograph, which is taken north of Seven Sisters Road. You're looking towards Finsbury Park. So it's north is away to the right. You can see there is a really appreciable slope down to the right because we're hugging the side of quite a steep slope. And from there, that section, the river runs into Hackney. Well, it's in Hackney at that point. It runs further on into Hackney. And this is what it looked like in the 19th century. It runs past the East and the West Reservoir, and you can walk along beside it. And we are told, allegedly, that in the early part of the 20th century, the area became popularly known as the Lake District of North London. Frankly, I think it's probably rubbish, but anyway. If you go to the East Reservoir, which is now a nature reserve, that is the modern terminal point of the river. Quite a lot of the water is taken off, actually, to a treatment works at Copper Mills further north, but what remains goes down into the East Reservoir, keeps the East Reservoir topped up, and the East Reservoir is a sort of reserve reservoir. They can draw that at times of drought. And there's a cafe there in what used to be a coal house for a pumping station. Some of you may have been there. And I rather like the inscription on the side of the building. These reservoirs, the property of the New River Company, were begun in the year 1830, completed 1833, under the direction of William Chadwell Milne, their engineer, Robert Percy Smith, governor. The governor of the company was the chairman. And you notice that the engineer's name is as big as that of the chairman. 19th century water engineers were not modest men. William Chadwell Milne was remarkable because he succeeded his father, Robert Milne, and they were successively chief engineers of the New River Company for an astonishing 96 years between them. Both of them died in harness. And William Chadwell Milne built this, which if you know Stoke Newington you'll be familiar with, the Castle Pumping Station, as it's now known, Castle Climbing Centre, next to Green Lanes, and it's still there. You can see these buttresses on the right. God knows why he chose to make it look like a Scottish baronial castle, but he did. The buttresses are interesting because they're not actually buttresses. They're extensions of the wall to hold the enormous flywheels of the steam pumping engines which were installed in there. And the other reason they're interesting is that they have a monogram on them. And you would think, wouldn't you, it would be something like NRC for New River Company? Not a bit of it. The monogram says Milne. I told you he wasn't a modest man. Milne also installed filter beds on the opposite side of Green Lanes to purify the water. And then in the 1930s, the Metropolitan Water Board, by the West Reservoir, built what was known as a secondary filter house, rather fetching Art Deco building with all sorts of rather fetching 1930s science fiction film equipment in. And this was known as a secondary filtration plant. The outdoor filter beds were the primary filters, and then there were secondary filters which also added chlorine to the water. That's the only sort of period shot I've been able to find of what this building looked like originally, because in the 1980s, for reasons I don't understand, they left the central bit but knocked down the two wings. And if you've been wild water swimming, open water swimming in the West Reservoir, you'll have seen that their replacements are rather less architecturally distinguished. There was a famous pub on the New River in Hackney. This is in Brownswood, roughly where Wilberforce Road and Summerfield Road now join. It was called the Highbury Sluice House. It was next to a sluice which controlled the flow of water, and apparently it was good for fishing. And there was also, in the Hackney part of the New River, an interesting structure which was known as the Highbury Frame. Just south of the Sluice House, Wilberforce Road, going towards Riversdale Road, the course of the New River crossed the course of the Hackney Brook. And to take it across, they put it basically in a sort of aqueduct, a bridge, with a wooden frame. It was known as the Highbury Frame, a wooden frame, and the water running through it, and it was raised up. I don't have any pictures. Nobody ever seems to have made a drawing or painting of the Highbury Frame, but this was a similar frame a bit further north at Bush Hill near Enfield, and that survived right through until the 1860s, when they scrapped it and put the New River in a big pipe running down Green Lanes from the Castle pumping station to Clissold Park. And where it entered Clissold Park, there was another sluice house, which today is a cafe called the Pump House. This is very, very misleading. It was never a pump. It's a sluice house. And the river itself ran through the private park of the owner of Clissold House, who obviously built Clissold House so that it was above and had a good view of the river, curving past it. And you can still see it's not part of the New River, it's just a long, thin pond, really, in Clissold Park, but it follows exactly the route of the New River, which then carried on along the north side of Stoke Newington Church Street and crossed Stoke Newington Church Street at the end of what is now Clissold Crescent, cut across towards Green Lanes, and then ran through the fields originally into Islington in what is now Petherton Road. So when they built Petherton Road, the houses, they built the houses on either side and a road on either side of the New River, and produced this really rather attractive, wide street. I naively assumed that the trees and the grass in the middle had always been there. Once they filled in the New River, the trees and grass had always been there. I saw a photograph of it in the 1970s recently. They just used it to park cars in the 1970s. So the landscape the landscaping is modern. The New River south of the reservoirs was taken out of commission in the late 1940s, probably 1948, we think. Most of it was filled in, and the water no longer flows south to New River Head. Originally, though, it went down through Islington, and it came to Sadler's Wells and past Sadler's Wells Theatre, and then ran into the circular reservoir at New River Head. And here is another picture of the circular reservoir, the water house, the irregularly shaped duck pond, and in the distance you can see the old St Paul's Cathedral. So we can date this from 1666 or earlier, because of course the cathedral was destroyed in the Great Fire of London. And there's a later picture of New River Head. You can see the circular reservoir, the water house. They tidied up the rather irregular reservoir at the side. You can see Christopher Wren's replacement for St Paul's in the background. You can also see two other things of interest. One is that, which looks like a windmill, and the other is this, which is a second rectangular reservoir. The windmill looks like a windmill because that's what it was. What happened was that around about 1700, the New River Company realised that London was expanding westward and it wanted to serve this lucrative market. But it discovered that the head of pressure from its existing reservoir was not enough to get the water all the way across the River Fleet and into places like Covent Garden and Soho, which the company wanted to serve. And one reason why the New River Company was so profitable was that up until this point, and for many, many decades subsequently, much of its service area, the City of London, was supplied purely by gravity. The water flowed down the river by gravity, and then it flowed in pipes to the customers by gravity. And there was no pumping involved. And pumping, however you do it, is very expensive, and the New River Company was spared that cost. But now they were told, if you create a second reservoir higher up the hill, that will give you a bigger head of pressure, and you can get the water across to the west. So they built the second reservoir, the rectangular one that you can see in the foreground there, and they needed to power a pump to get the water up from reservoir number 1 to reservoir number 2, and they decided they would do that using a windmill. Not a great success. The windmill was a pioneering design with 6 sails, and they blew off, not once, but twice. So they scrapped the windmill, and they replaced it with a horse mill, and a horse going round and round in the base of the windmill, driving the pump that took the water from the original reservoir up to the second reservoir. And that reservoir is still there. It's in Claremont Square in Islington, next to Pentonville Road. If you come up the hill from King's Cross towards the Angel, it's on the right. And again, it's covered over now, but again, it's still a fully functioning part of London's water supply. There is another picture of New River Head just before it disappeared, 1910 or 1911, this photograph. Somewhere in that jumble of houses on the right is the original water house. The old duck pond around the outside of the circular reservoir is now filter beds for cleaning the water, and it's all gone. It's been replaced, almost all gone. It's been replaced by this, which was completed in the 1920s, and was a headquarters for the new Metropolitan Water Board that replaced all the private water companies. And New River Head completely disappeared with a couple of exceptions. I'm sorry, I went to a Ukrainian wedding yesterday. I was just a bit thirsty this morning. If you go round the back of that building, you'll see this funny little round structure, which is the base of the original windmill. They took the top off at some point, but they left the base. And behind it, you can see on the left there what it was the structure that replaced the horse mill, and that was a steam-driven pumping station, a pumping engine, one of the earliest in London. And those, I'm pleased to say, after something like 70 years of being empty and neglected, they sit on Thames Water property, are about, assuming they can get the money together, and they have been raising the money for a very long time, they're about to be occupied by something called the Quentin Blake Centre for Illustration, which is going to be a museum of illustration. And it's a delight, really, that the buildings are going to find a new use. And the other survivor of the old New River Head is this. It's called the Oak Room, but it was originally known as the Court Room, and it was the room in the Waterhouse where the New River Company's Court of Directors used to meet. It was an interior created in the 1680s, and then when they built the new building, they took it apart and re-erected it in the new building. And it's a very splendid interior. It has beautiful wood panelling with very delicate carvings, which some people think might be by Grinling Gibbons, the great woodcarver of the 1680s. It's got a portrait of the king at the time, William III, in the ceiling. It's got very elaborate plasterwork. It's well worth a visit. You can go on sort of, what was it, open house weekend. You can get in. And it gives you some idea of what the New River Company thought of itself and how much money it had in the 1680s. By the end of the 18th century, this idea of permanent joint stock companies had taken root, but there were actually very few. And there were in the United Kingdom, in Britain, only 3 of any significance. One was the Bank of England, which lent money to the government. One was the East India Company, which owned much of Asia. And the other was the New River Company. They were the big 3. What, you may be asking yourself, did Londoners do for water before the New River? And the answer in the Middle Ages was some of them had wells on their own property. Some of them literally went down to the Thames and dipped a bucket in. And many of them relied on a system of conduits, which brought water into the City of London from springs outside the walls in lead pipes to conduit houses. There were eventually 16 of them at various points around the city. This was the largest of them. It was known as the Great Conduit. And you could, the water was free. You queued up, you filled up your bucket or whatever it was and took water home with you. Or if you didn't want to do that, you could buy water from a London water carrier. And that's a London water carrier. He's got a very distinctive tankard, as it was called, over his shoulder. And there's another picture. The tankard held 3 gallons of water, and he would go around from door to door, having filled up at the conduit, and sell you water by the glass or by the cup. The trouble was that London was expanding incredibly quickly. It quadrupled in size between 1500 and 1600, 50,000 population 1500, 200,000 1600, and there wasn't anything like enough water to go around. There was a real water crisis. And the New River Company was part of the solution to that, but before the New River Company, in the 1580s, a Dutchman or German called Peter Morris came along with superior German pumping technology and persuaded the City of London, the city authorities, to rent him the northernmost arch of London Bridge, in which he installed a water wheel that drove a pump that pumped water up from the Thames into a tank, which he then distributed to customers. And you won't believe me, but these are both pictures of old London Bridge, familiar version with the houses on top, and then the houses were destroyed and parts of the bridge were rebuilt in the 18th century. And in both pictures, at the left-hand northern end, you can see a sort of wooden barrier which was there to protect the water wheels of the London Bridge Waterworks. And Moritz had a very clever idea. He went one better than the conduits. You didn't have to go to him to get your water. He went to you. He laid a network of pipes under the streets of the city and positively encouraged people to connect to his pipes and to take his water, provided they paid him. And in doing that, he invented something which we take for granted. We all rely on networks of pipes and cables to bring services into our homes. Nobody had done that before. Moritz was the first. He had invented the networked utility. And the London Bridge Waterworks survived, astonishingly, right through until the 1830s, 1832, I think, when Old London Bridge was demolished. Here is a picture of it in the 1820s. You can see the water wheels there and the protecting structure at the northernmost end. And you may be asking yourself, what was the water like that the London Bridge Waterworks supplied, seeing as it came out of the Thames? And contemporaries wondered about that too. During the 19th century, there were, by my reckoning, a total of 17 parliamentary inquiries or royal commissions into London's water supply. I told you it was a hot political issue. The very first Parliamentary Select Committee inquiry was in the 1820s, and the superintendent of the London Bridge Waterworks was asked about the water that his company supplied and its quality. And he said, people like our water. They prefer it to the water from the New River because it is softer and therefore better for doing the laundry, which was not a trivial consideration, because laundry was terribly important. It was the way people kept clean. They didn't wash themselves, they did wash their clothes. And the harder the water, the more difficult it is to work up a decent lather, especially with pre-modern soap. And his questioner said, yes, I understand that, but what about drinking it? And the chap said, I wouldn't dream of drinking it. The pipes that Peter Moritz and then the New River Company, which borrowed his ideas, laid were made of wood. Mostly they were buried. These are the New River Company's pipes running west towards Soho and Covent Garden, where they ran over the River Fleet above ground. I won't surprise you to learn that they leaked, and leaked terribly, and they were made of elm pipes. Elm apparently is the wood least likely to rot. So what they would do is they would get a branch of elm, bore it out, and stick the thin end of one branch into the thick end of the next, and that way they would have a workable pipe. But they weren't kept permanently full. There was no permanent supply, the sort that we're used to. The water companies employed chaps like this. He's called a turncock, and it was his job to go around the streets on a regular schedule, turning on the water every 2 or 3 days for 2 or 3 hours. So the supply was extremely intermittent, and you had to know what the turncock schedule was, or you had to have somewhere to store the water. So lots of middle-class households had water cisterns like that, or water butts. This is in a house at the back of a property in St Martin's Lane in the 1820s, and you can see there's a big water butt there. There's a pipe and a tap above it. That's coming in from the main in the street. There's another tap at the bottom for drawing off water for cooking and cleaning and so on, and that's the household privy in the corner. And this was fine if you were a member of the middle class and you had your own property, you owned it or rented it. Not so good if you were poor. If you were lucky, living in a sort of slum court, your landlord might install a standpipe like this, and you'd pay a little extra in the rent, and he would pass that money on to the water company. But if you were unlucky, all he would install would be a communal cistern or butt, and those became a byword for filth. People used to abuse them, they used to wash their chamber pots in them, small boys would play games in them, they accumulated all kinds of rubbish and filth, and they were one of the reasons why the politics of London's water rose to the surface, because everybody agreed that this was awful and something needed to be done about it. Nobody was prepared to take the first step. I talked about the profitability of the New River Company and the growth of London, and so those two things together ensured that other water companies would start up to serve bits of London that the New River couldn't reach, and they hoped to make money. None of them were ever as profitable because they all had to pump water up from the river, either the Thames or the Lee, and that pumping, as I said, was expensive. This was one of the competing water companies. It was called the York Buildings Waterworks, and it was roughly where Charing Cross Station is now. And that is the old Watergate of York House, the mansion in the Strand, and that's still there. It's in Embankment Gardens now. It doesn't have its feet in the river anymore because they built the embankment in front of it. Apart from the fact that this looks rather striking, I've included this because you can see on the right a smoking chimney. The York Buildings Waterworks was an important milestone in the Industrial Revolution because it installed the first steam-driven pump in London. Indeed, the first steam engine of any kind in London. And it very quickly uninstalled it because it found that the coal bill was astronomical, the costs of operation were far too high. But by the 1740s, pumping steam engine technology had improved, and there were other water companies. So alongside the York Buildings, the Lambeth Waterworks started up with a pumping station and intake roughly where the Festival Hall is now. There was the Chelsea Waterworks, whose intake and pumping station was where the railway bridge into Victoria now crosses the Thames. And there was the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, among others. Southwark and Vauxhall's intake and pumping station was where Battersea Power Station was later built, and they all had steam engines, and they're all gone, with one exception. If you go to Kew Bridge, just on the north side of the river where the South Circular Road crosses the Thames, you will see this. This is the tower of a waterworks built for the Grand Junction Waterworks in the 1830s and enlarged in the 1850s, which is now the London Museum of Water and Steam. I can recommend a visit if you want to know more about this. It has some absolutely magnificent Victorian pumping engines, so huge you can't possibly get them all into a single photograph, and some of them are steamed from time to time, and very impressive they are when that happens. It also has an archive, where I research quite a lot of my book, which contains this wonderful photograph, which seems to me to sum up an awful lot about Victorian Britain. This is a photograph of the cylinder of the largest Cornish steam pumping engine ever made. It was made in the 1850s for a pumping station, in fact, in the Netherlands. The cylinder is lying on its side. It was made by a company called Harvey's in Hale in Cornwall. And Cornwall was a centre of pumping engine development because it had all those very deep mines that constantly flooded. And here you have Old Man Harvey standing in the middle with his cane and his fur-lined collar and his hat. And on the left you have a middle manager with his bowler hat, and on the right with a flat cap you have the foreman holding up a scale which tells you that this monster was 12 feet across. And this seems to me to say so much about the world-beating power of Victorian industry and also about Victorian class. As I say, lots of companies started up, so lots of Regency businessmen in the early part of the 19th century decided that they get in on the act as well. And they were sharks, all of them. You really didn't want to do business with anybody in the Regency period. They were dreadful people. And they all started new water companies. They weren't as clever as they thought they were. They saw an opportunity, but they also thought that they could compete with the existing water companies and indeed with one another. And we now know that water supply is what's called a natural monopoly. Doesn't make sense for more than one company to go to all the expense of installing all the infrastructure to supply water to any given district. These guys learned that the hard way. In many parts of London, there were 2 and sometimes 3 water companies competing. And of course, there were endless dirty tricks, and the customers got wise to what was going on, and they played one company off against another. And nobody made any money. Even the New River Company, it still made a profit, but its dividends collapsed because it was having to compete with these newcomers. And so in 1815, north of the river, and rather later south of the river, these companies to a secret agreement. It had to be secret because most of them had Acts of Parliament that authorised them to trade and to build pipes and so on. And many of those Acts of Parliament expressly forbade them from doing what they were now going to do. They agreed a truce, and they divided London up between them into a series of local monopolies, which made perfect sense economically, but infuriated the customers for a reason I'll come to. So London ended up with 8 water companies. The New River Company, serving the north and the city, the East London Waterworks, 2 companies in the West End, the Grand Junction and the West Middlesex, the Chelsea Waterworks, Chelsea and Westminster, the Kent Waterworks in the southeast, the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks along the South Bank, and the Lambeth Waterworks. Only the Southwark and Vauxhall and Lambeth still competed with one another. And what did the companies do when they'd done this? Yes, you've guessed it, they put their prices up by 25%, and consumers were absolutely furious because they realised they had nowhere else to go. They were going to have to pay these extortionate rates. And so we see grow up one of the very first consumer movements campaigning against the water companies. This is one manifestation of one of those campaigns. This is a cartoon from the 1820s called John Bull's Waterworks, or Unfeeling Speculators Threatening to Cut Off One of the Necessities of Life. And it's, not to put too fine a point on it, it's a riot of cock jokes. The beefy guys with axes are water company turncocks, and they are threatening to cut off the cocks, the taps, of any customer who does not pay the new rates. And there is John Bull on the right, straddling his cock, saying, for God's sake, don't cut it off. Two little boys in the back there, one's already lost his cock, the other is about to, poor little chap. Woman on the left, straddling what she calls her husband's cock. Somebody at one of these lectures once asked me if there was any sex in my book, and I said, there is no, this is a book about water supply, there is, and then I remembered this. Don't you think that she's showing really quite a lot of leg? And it seems to me that there's an implied offer there to the turncock, that if he were to leave her husband's cock alone, he might find something to his advantage. And floating around in the middle of that, there is a piece of paper on which is written Bill in Parliament to authorise certain parishes to supply themselves with water to check the extortions of the monopolising companies. One of the very first public appearances of an idea which, as I said, was to gain traction throughout the 19th century, which was maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea not to leave something as important to the public interest as water supply in the hands of private profit-making companies. It took a long time for that to work its way through. I'm going to cut this short, but I'm just going to tell you about one other thing. The water companies mostly got their water out of the River Thames and the River Lee, and there's a picture of the Thames in the 1840s, looks quite picturesque. It wasn't. It was absolutely full of sewage. Some clever individual had invented the flushing water closet, and flushing water closets overwhelmed the traditional cesspits where Londoners had deposited the contents of their privy, which had to be cleaned out from time to time by night soil men, but sat, in your backyard or under your basement. The amount of liquid, the fluid that these things produce was completely overwhelming. So the outflows from these water closets were diverted into the sewers. And where did the sewers go? The sewers have been designed just to take rainwater runoff. Where do the sewers go? They emptied into the Thames. And here is another example of campaigning, consumer campaigning. This is a pamphlet from the 1820s called the Dolphin or Grand Junction Nuisance. A dolphin is a structure in water there as a sort of protection. This dolphin is the thing that looks like a sort of octagonal garden shed. It is protecting the intake of the Grand Junction Waterworks, which in those days was in Chelsea, not at Cubridge. And so you know where we are, that's the Royal Hospital Chelsea on the left, and in between you can see a channel. That was a sewer. And the author of the pamphlet pointed out that the intake was right opposite the mouth of the sewer, so anything that came down the sewer was going to get sucked into the pipes of the Grand Junction Waterworks, and as a result its customers were being served a fluid saturated with the impurities of 50,000 houses, a dilute solution of animal and vegetable substances in a state of putrefaction, alike offensive to the sight, disgusting to the imagination, and destructive to health. And he was not wrong. The scientists backed him up. Here from 1851, pioneering microscopic analysis of London water discovered that according to the present system of London's water supply, a portion of the inhabitants of the metropolis are made to consume a portion of their own excrement, and moreover to pay for the privilege. And the cartoonists got in on this one too. Monster soup, commonly called Thames water. The lady is looking through a microscope, has seen all these horrible little bugs and beasties. She has been drinking a cup of tea, but when she realises what's in the water, you see the cup of tea has fallen from her nerveless hands. And here's another cartoon from the 1860s. Here is one of those company turncocks, 1840s, one of those company turncocks going on his rounds, turning on the water, two little boys. One is saying, I say, Tommy, I'm blowed if there isn't a man a-turning on the cholera. And that is remarkable because it was not until the 1860s that the medical profession widely accepted that cholera was waterborne. The public and cartoonists representing public opinion knew damn well in the 1840s that there was something wrong with London's water and it needed to be cleaned up. And as some of you may know, eventually the Thames was cleaned up thanks to Joseph Bazalgette's great network of intercepting sewers following the Great Stink of 1858, hottest summer on record, and London's water companies were told to move their intakes out of the tidal Thames and the tidal Lee, where all this sewage flowed backwards and forwards all the time, to cleaner water upriver in what was in fact the very first government intervention to curb the activities of the private water companies, something called the Metropolis Water Act in 1852. But there I'm going to stop because I talked for too long, and if anybody wants to ask me questions, then they're pleased to answer them, and then, as I say, later we could perhaps do some business at the back there. Anyway, there we are. That's a sort of short history of London's water. Bludgeoned into silence. Anybody got any questions? Anything they wanted to say? This lady over here.
I just want to make a small comment. I'm from South Norfolk, and at the moment, similar pictures of the content of the Waveney Valley, of the river, are being produced with E. coli and other.
Yeah, and it's not just South Norfolk. It's all over the country. The private water companies that we now have following the privatisation in 1989 have paid their shareholders enormous dividends and have stinted on investment, particularly in sewage treatment works, and the sewage treatment works are all being overwhelmed, and so they are routinely discharging untreated sewage into watercourses and onto beaches, and it's a scandal, and somebody needs to do something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just sort of contrasting the sophistication, relative sophistication of some of these developments in the 18th, 19th centuries compared to the vast distances that the Romans used to bring water. I mean, from the Alps to Rome to southern France to Spain, with none of those contraptions. I suppose it's just stating the obvious how miraculous their water engineers were.
They were great engineers generally, and particularly hydraulic engineers, the Romans. The important difference is that Roman cities were watered by aqueducts which emptied into communal basins, like the medieval conduit houses in London. The innovation in London in the late 16th, early 17th century was to deliver the water not to a series of nodal points around the city, but to individual houses. And in the 18th century, European visitors to London were overwhelmed by this. They get water into every house because other important European cities delivered it to, Paris, you had to go and get the water. Rome, all those fancy Baroque water, the Trevi Fountain and so on in Rome, they're not just ornamental. That was Rome's water supply up until the 19th century. London was supplying water to individual houses from the late 16th century onwards, and that was a remarkable innovation. Yeah.
Maybe tangential, but can you say anything about the filtration beds on the River Lee in relation to the thing?
Well, yes, I've cut this short. There was going to be a little bit about filter beds, but I'll give it to you now without the illustrations. The 1852 Metropolis Water Act stipulated two important things. One was that the water companies had to move their intakes away from the polluted tidal Thames. The other was they had to filter their water. And they passed it through what were known as slow sand filters, which were large areas of fine sand on coarse sand on gravel, and pipes at the bottom to take the water away, and you flooded the raw river water onto the top of this, and it trickled down through there. And the first slow sand filter beds were brought to London in the 1820s by a man called James Simpson, chief engineer of two of the London water companies, who was also the man, before the government told the water companies to do this, he pioneered going upriver for cleaner water. He took the Lambeth Waterworks upriver in the they made the decision in the 1840s. And these slow sand filter beds were extraordinarily effective at cleansing the water. The mid-19th century engineers thought they were just, basically they were mechanical filters. They were strainers, so the stuff came onto the top and all the bits were filtered out. What we now know actually is that they work biologically. On the top layer of sand there forms something known as the rather charming German word of a Schmutzdecke, or slime blanket, which is basically a layer of good bugs which eat the bad bugs in the raw water, and what comes out the bottom is 98% pure and clean. And this technology, which is a bit greedy of space, you need quite a lot of space, but is extraordinarily effective, is still used to purify 2/3 of London's water, primary filtration through slow sand filters. And that's unique, actually. No other city in the developed world uses these things quite so extensively. The filter beds are by the River Lee, known as the Middlesex beds and the Essex beds, up by Lea Bridge Road, were built for the East London Waterworks. After 1852, they used to take their water from a position at Old Ford by the Olympic Park. This was full of sewage, and indeed was the site in 1866 of London's last cholera outbreak, so polluted was the water. There's a chapter about that in the book. They moved the intake up to Lea Bridge, beyond the tidal limit of the Thames, so the water was cleaner, not that much cleaner, but cleaner. And then they filtered it. And the filter beds they've been replaced now because actually they were quite small, as filter beds go, but they are a survivor of this very important leap forward in the treatment of London's water, which took place after the 1850s and immediately after. And it made a huge, huge difference. I mean, London's water was suddenly, as it still is today, among the cleanest in the world. I mean, it's not as clean as New York's, which they don't need to filter. One more question. Yes, lady down here.
You describe, I think, the fact that the water companies owned the mechanism for getting people the water. Was there any sense also of what I think is happening with something, for example, in the States, of companies buying up the land from which water is captured, so actually buying the resource as well as the mechanism?
No, there wasn't. You're referring the two particular dramatic examples in the States. One is the New York water supply. New York City bought vast areas of the Catskill Mountains and built reservoirs and so on. One reason why New York's water is so very clean. The other is California, where the city of Los Angeles notoriously stole all the water from the Owens River Valley, which is about 300 miles away, and built a huge, great aqueduct. And there are lots of... California's water is an even worse scandal than Britain's water, actually. It's absolutely dreadful environmentally and in all sorts of other ways. London water companies continued to get the water out of the Thames because basically there was loads and loads of water in the Thames, and it wasn't quite free. They had to pay a small sum to the Thames Conservancy every year, but basically it was free. Northern cities like Liverpool, like Manchester, like Sheffield did go and buy land in the mountains and build reservoirs. So Lake Vyrnwy in North Wales was built by Liverpool Corporation, and then they built I can't remember how long it is, about 50, 60 mile long aqueduct to take the water. So it happened in those cities because they didn't have enough good quality water close to hand. But in London, we had the Thames. Periodically, people would say, well, is there going to be enough water in the Thames and so on? The answer was yes, there is. And still, I can't remember what the proportion is, but most of London's water comes out of the Thames. If you walk from Teddington up to Windsor, there are, by my count, there are 10 water intakes which are taking water out of the river and pumping it to Thames Water Treatment Works, or a treatment works belonging to a company called Affinity Water. Right, I've talked for long enough.